Hello, everyone. My name is David Ortiz. I am the faculty fellow for the Center for Latin American and Border Studies, CLABS. Thank you for coming to our second speaker for this series for the fall. Hola a todos, bienvenidos. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Mi nombre es David Ortiz. Soy el faculty fellow del Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos y de la Frontera aquí en NMSU. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Este es nuestro segundo speaker series de este semestre del fall. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Vamos a dejar unos 10-15 segundos a que termine de entrar la gente en el cuarto de Zoom. Tuvimos un poco de problemas técnicos, pero los pudimos resolver antes de que empezara la plática. Así que estamos todo bien. Thank you so much for waiting. We are waiting till the last couple of participants trickle in here. Just give us a couple of seconds and we will be starting this presentation. Okay, I can see that the actual count for participants has stabilized a little bit. So I think we will go ahead and begin. Hola a todos, bienvenidos. Bienvenidos de nuevo. Vamos a empezar. Hello, everyone. So it is our pleasure seeing you here, and it's a pleasure to have Dr. Alejandra Diaz de Leon with us today to talk to us about her latest book, a really, really amazing book. I actually bought it early this week and started reading it. It's actually amazing and a very needed piece of work. So there's not a lot of research on this particular part of migration. So thank you so much for that. I want to say a couple of things before we start about how the session is going to get conducted. You will see that you have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use that Q&A button at any time during Dr. Alejandra Diaz de Leon's presentation to pose a question to us. And we will wait till the end of the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, we will present Dr. Diaz de Leon with all of those questions for you so that she can get a chance to answer them. Also, in our chat, we will post right now a couple of things. One of them will be all of our social media, but also another one will be a discount code for Dr. Diaz de Leon's book. So if you are attending here, we've been posting this on social media too, but if you're attending here and you are really interested in what Dr. Diaz de Leon is saying, please go buy her book. It's amazing. Walking Together, Central Americans and Transit Migration Through Mexico. It really is worth not only your money, but your time. It's pretty incredible. So we will be posting a link to in the chat to the book, and we will be posting a discount code for it. So our CLABS GA, Marta Chavez, will be doing that for us here in a few minutes. Before I introduce our second speaker, today for this talk, I want to really thank our CLABS Speaker Series Committee, Dr. Berta Bermudez Tapia, Dr. Christopher Brown, Dr. Neil Harvey, Marta Chavez, and myself for getting us a really great slate of speakers this whole year, this semester, and the one coming, of which one of them is Dr. Diaz de Leon. So Dr. Diaz de Leon, thank you so much for being here. I will introduce you a little bit before you begin, and then I will give you the floor. So without further ado, Dr. Alejandra Diaz de Leon, our speaker today, is an assistant professor in migration and violence at the Center for Sociological Studies at El Colegio de Mexico. She holds a PhD in sociology and an MA in human rights from the University of Essex. Her research focuses on human rights, solidarity, and the creation of bonds trust, and cooperation among strangers during contexts of violence and uncertainty, like the transit of Central Americans through Mexico to the United States. In her recent book, Walking Together Central Americans and Transit Migration Through Mexico, published by the University of Arizona Press, she draws on multi-sided research to contribute to debates on the role of social networks in clandestine migration processes and to discuss on how people create social networks and trust under violent and stressful situations. The detailed ethnographic narratives and accessible writing of the book weave together theory with empirical observations to highlight and humanize the migrant experience. So, Dr. Diaz de Leon, thank you for being here with us, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited. Thank you, David, Berta, Marta. And I'll share. I cannot share my screen. I cannot share my screen. So I need someone to give me permission. And you're on mute.
Marqueta or someone in instructional services, can you help us to allow Dr. Diaz de Leon to share her screen, please?
Well, while they do that, we can.
Give me 1 second.
Okay. So in the presentation, I tried to use mostly pictures and not so many words, because I think the pictures are nicer. Most of the pictures are mine or from people from my projects, unless otherwise noted. And if you want to talk about the pictures, we can do that when I start doing the presentation. So that's an important note. Maybe I can do it now? Yes.
You should be able to now, yes.
Okay, so this is a cover of my book. Oh, no, but I'm very excited about talking a little bit about the book. So this is a cover, Walking Together, Central Americans and Transit Migration Through Mexico. This beautiful picture is by Ruben Figueroa. No, I'll remember his. Yes, Ruben Figueroa. Wait, let me see if I can move it. Yeah, Ruben Figueroa. I always say his name incorrectly. And it's a picture of migrants now walking together, and he gave me the picture for the book. He's a very, very amazing activist, and he has been looking for disappeared migrants along the migrant route for many, many years, and now he's applying for asylum in the US because he's been threatened because of the job he does. Okay, in this presentation, I will talk about the context for migrants, the research questions, very quickly about my methodology, my results, and I will conclude, and I'll try to be no more than 40 minutes so that we can have a nice conversation. In this picture, you can see a migrant trying to climb on top of the freight train while the train is running. This is an old picture from 2017, and it's in Palenque. So this is a map of Mexico. I guess many of you are familiar with the map of Mexico, but I just want you to see it with the eyes of a migrant, no? Every year, thousands of migrants, including Central American migrants, cross through Mexico on their way to the United States. Here is a map, and you can see the expanse of the territory. So this is 3,000 kilometers long. And just to give you an idea, these are the sites where I did fieldwork, but this is Tenosique, and it's one of the first stops for the migrants after they cross from Guatemala. From Tenosique to Palenque, and these 2 points look super close together, it's 2 weeks walking for migrants, or 4 or 5 hours in a very crappy small combi van, no? In a very small van. So I just want everyone to remember how difficult it is to cross Mexico if you don't have documents, if you cannot ride a long freight bus, if you cannot take an airplane. It takes so long to cross Mexico. These are the main train routes when I was doing fieldwork between 2015 and 2008. And 2018, 19, more or less. And it's more or less the route that the train takes, because the poorest migrants, the ones who cannot hire good smugglers or expensive smugglers, usually follow these routes. Some of them ride the train. This is a picture of the train. This is a migrant house in Apizaco, but the interesting thing is you can see the train that migrants ride here. There's a migrant on top of the train there. And to ride the train, to get on top of the train is very difficult and dangerous, because if the train is moving, migrants have to run next to the train, hold to somewhere, and then hoist themselves up, put their legs on top of the, of the carts, and then get on top. No, if they make a mistake, they can fall under and die. The government of Mexico recently, in the last, 4 or 5 years, has put these concrete structures. They're called durmientes next to the train tracks. And the only purpose of these structures, the only one, is to prevent migrants from getting on top of the train or off the train. So if migrants jump off the train to get off, they hurt themselves. And this prevents migrants from running next to the train and getting on top. So I think this shows how the government is really trying to stop migrants from moving up north, because that's the only usefulness. The trains are going faster now. Some trains are not running anymore. So sometimes migrants have to walk. This is a picture by Ruben Figueroa of migrants in Veracruz. I think they're walking. You can see that they don't have backpacks anymore. And this means that they were robbed already, no? And they just have to carry their things in plastic bags. When they cannot take the train or they cannot pay for a bus, they have to walk next to the highways or in the train tracks. If there is a roadblock, they have to make detours, and they are in the selva, in the monte, they say me tiro al monte. So they have to walk next to the highway. As soon as they see a roadblock, a checkpoint, they need to jump to the jungle and do a 2 or 3 day detour. The detours are very dangerous because they go to isolated places, as you can see here, and they become victims of criminals, but also migration agents that are like a little bit rogue and are criminals. So they beat them, they rape them, they kidnap them. There's cartels, there's gang members, and there's like regular criminals who take advantage of them. But also we need to take into account that migrants are exposed to the sun all the time, to the elements, they get scratches, animals bite them, they go hungry, they have no water to drink. So it's very, very dangerous for them to cross Mexico, no? They get injured feet, they get sick because of the water that they drink. So this is a summary of what happens, no? The migrant chases you, you have to pay the gangs, the cartels kidnap you, the neighbors call the migrant on you. Other migrants steal your backpack. There are people pretending to be migrants to trick you. Crossing Mexico is the most difficult thing I've done. So in the migration route, there's a lot of uncertainty because, as we have just seen in this testimony, the route is very fluid. There's a lot of ways that migrants can go. They can go to the right, they can go to the left. There's a lot of train tracks. They can follow the train tracks. They can go next to the highways. They can take a bus. But also the people on the road are fluid. So maybe that police officer really moonlights as a sicario. Maybe that person who's pretending to be a migrant is really trying to enganchar you, to hook you and to take you in a place where you will be kidnapped. Maybe that guy is not really a migrant, but is a coyote. So there's a lot of uncertainty on the road. No, you don't know where to go. Everything changes all the time. The Mexican government changes the rules, changes the checkpoints. A new cartel comes to town, but also the people are different. The migrant house is closed, open. So everything becomes very complicated for the migrants, no? However, migrants need up-to-date and reliable information in order to navigate their crossing through Mexico. And they need emotional support. So in this very dangerous area, I'm asking, how do Central American migrants in transit survive the journey without the help of their traditional social networks? Because when they're crossing Mexico, they're separated from their networks because they're either in Central America or in the US, but it's very difficult to contact them. And even if they can contact them, the information that the family has about crossing, I don't know, a year ago, is not useful anymore because everything has already changed. And can new social networks, trust, and cooperation happen in a context of scarcity, violence, and uncertainty? So as we have seen, crossing Mexico is very dangerous. It's very violent for the migrants. There's a lot of uncertainty about where to go, which information you can trust, who is really that person, no? But can they form new social networks, trust, and cooperation? And this is important because most of the literature on migration and undocumented migration has shown that social networks are very important for migrants in order to decide where to go, what to do, how to survive. So it's very important to have someone to give you information, but if your family cannot do it, can you find someone else? So what I study in this book is how migrants in transit who are surrounded by violence and uncertainty manage to form social ties with people who are strangers to them. Here in the picture, we can see like more train tracks, no, in Palenque. This is a picture of me when I was very young doing my fieldwork. I was interviewing a migrant, and here you can see that trains. They were showing me how to get on top of the train. Well, my methodology, I did fieldwork between 2015 and 2018. And my idea was to do multi-sided research to follow the people. So what I did is I did fieldwork in the southern border of Mexico and in the northern border of Mexico. And I didn't follow the migrants along the route because that's very dangerous for me and for them. If I were to get injured or caught, what would they have done without me? But also my presence would have made them more visible, no? So I decided to do multi-sided fieldwork with the idea to maybe find the same migrants along the route. It proved to be impossible. I only found one migrant in both places, but I did a bunch of fieldwork now along the road. And I spent time in migrant shelters, soup kitchens, churches, and wherever migrants gathered. I had thousands of conversations with migrants in transit, but only did 50 formal interviews, which is a very good number, mostly with men, but also with some women or families. And it was mostly with men because when I was doing field work, most of the people who were migrating were first Central American migrants from Honduras, mostly Guatemala, El Salvador, and most of them men. These new tendencies of families migrating together and more women migrating, I couldn't observe them. Also, I have observed that women have different migration routes than men because usually they are sent with better smugglers that put them in hotels and help them take buses and things like that. So it was not so common for me to see women. And we talked about the journey, their lives, the friends they had made, what they wish they had known before leaving their home countries. I also asked them to show me their backpacks to see what they brought and to see if there was any difference between experienced migrants and inexperienced migrants, no, in the way they prepared. And you could see that inexperienced migrants had 3 pairs of jeans, for example, that were completely useless in the road, no? While experienced migrants had ropes, a first aid kit, a knife, things like that. While parts of the interviews were sad and people were obviously struggling, I could see that they enjoyed talking to me and having their story recorded. And what I have been doing lately, not for this book, but lately, is I record it and I send it to them through WhatsApp, and they love it because they send it back to their families and things like that. And well, we can talk a little bit in the questions about ethics of researching vulnerable people and violence. What I tried to do was obviously get informed consent. In the mornings, I introduced myself and I said that I was a researcher and I wanted to talk to whoever wanted to talk to me about their journeys, but not necessarily about violence. And I think this is important because many researchers that go to shelters and migrant houses, and sometimes, journalists are looking for the saddest cases. And I think that makes it more difficult for migrants to open up to you. And it also, I don't know, I don't like that. I try to do deep listening. So I really listened to the migrants and I didn't interrupt them. I had my questions, but I didn't interrupt them. And I didn't stop the interview when it stopped being interesting for me, which made the interviews very long, but also they could tell me everything. And I think that's an important way to get things you didn't expect to get, no? Like the friendships, what they did to keep entertained. I didn't ask about violence directly. Of course, it appeared in the interviews, but I didn't start with that. And I changed topics if I could tell they were uncomfortable. And I was mindful about the way they perceived me, no, and my privilege and the situation in which I was. All of those things, I think, led me to have very good interviews and allowed me to have I don't know, a nuanced book that I think shows the good and the bad and treats migrants as complete people. So yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of my findings. This picture is very bad. It's blurry, but I like it because it's in a picture that I took in La 72 in a migrant shelter in Tamaulipas. It's named after the 72 migrants that were executed in 2010 in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, by a cartel. And what they did in the chapel, I don't know if it's there anymore, but they have this big cross, like this huge one, representing the dead migrants, but around it, they have 72 crosses for the 72 executed migrants with some of their information, if they were from Honduras, Guatemala, Ecuador, and their names. Most of the crosses are white or nothing is written there because we don't know their names, no, but I think it reminds us of the violence they experienced. So the most important thing that I discovered through the interviews is that migrants need social ties, which is obvious, but it's very important. Regardless, they have this great need to form social ties with other migrants around them. Regardless of the risk of being taken advantage of, or worse, robbed, kidnapped, or murdered, time and again they chose to open themselves up to other migrants and to form associations and networks with them. And I will show you how. This is a map that migrants were studying in La 72. It was an old map when the picture was taken. So, but you can see now how they're there interchanging, talking about their experiences. So yeah, that's important. Migrants form social ties for two reasons. The first one, I think, is the emotional need to feel seen on the road. So the road dehumanizes them. It makes them feel like they do not matter, makes them feel ungrievable, no? Like if they die, no one will care, no one will remember. So there's a lot of migrants have told me that they feel they're already missing migrants because they don't remember the phone numbers of their families, or their families don't have a phone, or they lost their phone on the road, or that little piece of paper, and they know that if they die or disappear, no one will ever tell their moms, especially their moms they're worried about, that they died, no? So they feel they're missing migrants already, even if they get to the United States. But also they feel ungrievable in the sense that they feel no one cares about them while they're in Mexico, that they're less than human. And this guy told me this anecdote about how they were like with a bunch of migrants sleeping in the, on the floor in front of the migrant house, covered in trash bags, black trash bags, because they were cold and it was raining. And some guy just cycled on top of them with his bicycle, and they think the person didn't do it on purpose. They think he just thought they were garbage lying on the floor. And that made him so, so sad, because he feels like that's the way they are seen in Mexico, no? Like no one cares about them. So as soon, for example, this is what Michael says. As soon as you cross, they make you less human with the abuse. By the time you're in Mexico, you don't recognize yourself. If you could see me in Honduras, I am a person there. I am a missing migrant already. If I die crossing the desert, my mom will never find out where my body ends up. Take a picture of me so that someone remembers me. It's important to them to find someone that sees them in the eyes, that understands what they're experiencing, that is not disgusted by the way they look, they smell, that's not scared of them. And that can only be really given by another migrant, because I can be very nice to them, but I'm still a Mexican woman, no, who can go at any point. And of course, the second reason to form networks and to associate with others is strategy. Because of course they understand, as soon as they cross into Mexico, they realize the country is super big, as I showed you, but they realize they have no idea what they're doing. Even if they Googled before, they realize everything changes all the time. Who takes care of your backpack if you take a shower? You have no idea where to go. You don't have enough money anymore. So they form social bonds in order to help each other and for practical reasons, no? So the three main types of social ties that I talk about in my book are migrant families that left together. We'll discuss them in this presentation. Road families, which are like small groups of men that get together to become like a very strong social network that migrates together, and the transient community of migrants. I'm not talking about that today because we don't have time, but it's basically the way a community like that gets formed by everyone migrating at the same time, where they share resources, information, a little bit of gossip, and it helps migrants understand where they're going and get up-to-date and reliable information. Okay. We'll start with the road families. So road families are small groups, according to what I observed, of mostly male migrants. When I was doing fieldwork, they were mostly Honduran, Salvadorian, Guatemalan. And the nationality didn't seem to be very important for them. Most of them are young because most of the migrants were young, but you could have a road family of 5 people with someone that's 18 and another person that's 30, 40, 50, no? These people meet on the road after spending very little time together. They decide that they trust each other and they want to go together to the northern border. Generally, they meet on the train tracks while they're waiting for the train to leave, on the migrant houses where they can stay for a day or two, or even in the bus stations, for example, in Guatemala, when they're waiting to catch the bus, but they know they're going to the northern border, no? Very quickly, after talking for a little while, they decide they trust each other, and we'll discuss what they pay attention to when they are deciding who they trust. and they start migrating together. Most of these groups get together in the southern border and try to go to the northern border together before. And these people were strangers before. The first time I met one of these groups, they told me, yeah, we're brothers. We're like brothers. We really trust each other. And I asked them, how long have you known each other? And they told me 5 days. So that's how quickly intimacy happens on the migrant road, no? So they don't form these deep bonds with everyone. I have observed that there are 5 elements that help the group formation. First is physical proximity, and that's very obvious, no? But they have to be in the same area for a little bit of time. So they usually start, when they're waiting, they usually start cautiously talking with the people around them. And if someone gets very annoying or untrustworthy, people move away. But if not, they stay there. So they usually get together with the people who are closer to them. Time, this is interesting. In general, when we see like normal families or friendship groups, it takes a long while to decide that you trust someone, no? And the families have been going on forever. No, you are born into a family that has established trust through many, many generations. And with your friendship groups, it takes you forever. No, you don't get together with someone after 2 hours. However, here they only have, I don't know, tops a day, in general 4 or 5 hours, to have conversations and observe each other, and very quickly they decide they want to go together. And a conversation is important. That's number 3. They start having superficial and cautious conversations about their lives in Honduras or Guatemala, their favorite brand of coffee, what they want to do in the United States, but they never talk about important things like their families, if they have any money, if they have any guns, if they have a phone. Initially, the conversation is superficial, but they start paying attention to see if the person looks humble. And I say this with air quotes because that's different for every migrant, no? But they're trying to suss each other out to see if they have a legitimate, again, that they consider legitimate reason for going to the United States, for example, to work, family reunification, to help someone, if they have things in common, for example, if they're Catholic, if they look humble, which means like they don't speak too much, but they don't speak too little, they share information. So it's a very delicate balance, because if you're super generous, people will think you're a smuggler and they will move away from you. But if you're very quiet, they will think you're spying for the cartels and they will move away from you. So the conversation really has to be on point to signal your trustworthiness. The fourth is appearance. So they have to look like migrants. And this sounds a little bit obvious, but they pay attention to people who look like they have been struggling in the road. So who are tanned or burned, who have scratches, but also who have used clothes, that have clearly seen the sun, caps, a backpack. They pay attention to the shoes. Once I was interviewing this person who I thought I was a migrant, and then everyone came to me and told me, no, he's a smuggler because his shoe soles are not worn down. You can tell he's a smuggler. So they pay attention to that, again, to see if the person is trustworthy, no? But a lot of people cover all this, no? They're close by, they can talk quickly, they look like migrants, they're humble. So when I kept asking migrants, okay, yes, but why that guy and not that guy? No, they look identical. They both look very respectable. They told me, it's like falling in love. And that's like the fifth one, no, leap of faith. It's like falling in love. You just, when you see him, you just know. When you look in the eyes, you just know. So this leap of faith, I think, relates to the emotional need of finding someone who wants to who can fulfill this emotional need of making you feel like a person again, no? And remember, these are mostly men, which I find very interesting. And they most of them described it as falling in love, when you know, things like that. So once that happens, they get together, they decide they trust each other, and when you know with your heart, you see. So they share resources, they share information, they divide tasks, they keep each other company, and they become like a family, or like a very, very close group of friendships. And this is very interesting because they have only known each other for 5 hours, no? Or for a day. And they start sharing information that I think in the migrant route is very stupid to share if you don't trust the person. So for example, they start sharing the phone numbers of their family members, and sharing the phone number of your family member is dangerous if you don't trust the person, because then you can be kidnapped and they can call them to ask for ransom. They share where they hide the money they're hiding, how much money they have, but also they share information about where to go, what migrant house to take, and they pool resources. They get all the money together and they buy things together. They steal things together if they are hungry. So, for example, Mario says, if I have money, it is as if my friend has money. In fact, after we met, I couldn't pay for my lunch, and he said, if I have money, you have money. I am here for everything you need. And now no one is sending money to him, but my family is sending me money. So I have money to eat. We both eat. If I only have enough money for me, no one eats. I met Mario in the southern border, and as you can see at the beginning, his friend was paying for everything, but now he had the money and he was paying for everything. And what's interesting is that Mario didn't drop the friend after the friend stopped being useful, because they had already become close, no? They had developed trust, they had developed solidarity. So these very, very deep bonds of trust and solidarity become very important for them, because they can cooperate in everything I told you. But sometimes, even if they have catastrophic things happening to them, people stay with them. So for example, I interviewed a couple of women, two women. Mostly the groups are men, but these were two women, and one of them had lost a leg on the train, and the other one was waiting for her in a migrant shelter until the Red Cross gave her a new prosthetic leg to cross to the US. And there's a couple of stories about people who die on the journey, and the people in their group decide to get deported with the body to make sure that the body is given back to the family. When people break their ankles, they wait for them. Of course, I don't want to romanticize, and in the book you can see that there's also stories of people who became friends with people and they migrated for 7 days together, and then they were kidnapped, no, or led to a security house. But in many, many instances, these groups really, really help migrants gather resources, feel like they matter, and go to the northern border successfully. So I think this is very interesting. Here in this picture, you can see the lockers with the backpacks and the sneakers, and the shoes they wear, no, when they try to migrate. Another association that I talk about in the book are families that migrate together. And in that chapter, I explore how the dynamics of families who consider themselves families in Central America and who decided to migrate together change while they're crossing Mexico. And I also explore how they interact with migrants in the road. So these families include, I'm using a very lax Latin American definition of family, no, familia. So they include many, many people who are related. For example, I saw a lot of groups of old men who were related, the father, the son, the nephew, the cousin, straight families like husband, wife, and children, queer families, or even people not related by blood, but who consider themselves uncles, compadres, cousins in the Latin American sense of the word, no? So if they consider themselves a family, when they were talking to me and they have lived together, I consider them a family. So like most of the migrants I met, families are very surprised and unprepared for the length and the violence of the road. As soon as they cross to Tenosique, they're overwhelmed by the distance, by the heat, by the violence. However, instead of reacting by opening themselves up to others, they focus all their trust inward. And this is how the literature in catastrophes has shown that families generally react in very violent situations. They look for themselves, for the family first. So the families that live together, when faced with the dangers of the road, instead of doing what the road families do, they close themselves up and they focus all their trust inward. And as many told me, the danger is in the others, no? And it's easier to trust people in your family. You know them, you know they won't betray you, you know that if they betray you, they will be punished when they go back home. So, I mean, it seems to make sense, but in this short presentation, I will show you that it's not ideal to get close together with your family, because remember, what migrants need, besides feeling emotionally supported, is up-to-date and reliable information. So for example, Reno told me, most of the time, some migrants take advantage of others. They are very selfish and will hurt you. Not everyone, but some of them. And then he followed on by saying, that's why I prefer to migrate with my family. In this picture, you can see the train tracks from another perspective. That's a group of migrants waiting for the train. And you can see the durmientes that I told you that the government puts to prevent migrants from getting off the train there. So in general, these families try to separate themselves from others. A subset of these families are straight families, and I will talk a little bit about straight families because I think the dynamics are very interesting. First, let's see what Marlo says. I came here with my brother because he won't let me die and I won't let him die. So I don't trust others because I don't know which type of people they are. As you can see, they're reinforcing the idea that people around them are dangerous. Okay, straight families include women, men, and children, but can also include straight couples, like just a man and a woman migrating together, no? They left together from Central America, and that's important because they're not, for example, what Wendy Boyd has already conceptualized as protective pairings, which is when women get together with men in the route to prevent being raped. That's a very interesting strategy, but here we're observing couples that left together Central America. They were usually partnered, rarely formally married, but they considered themselves husband and wife, no? And they left together from Central America. And when I talked to these families, I observed how the gender dynamics of the family became even more entrenched when they were migrating. And I think this is because of two reasons. First, men feel keenly that they have lost ownership of the public space when they're in Mexico, and that relates a little bit with the loss of dignity that we talked about. They cannot really walk down the street, they must look down, they must hide. In the shelters, for example, men have to, well, everyone, but men feel keenly annoyed that they have to follow instructions to be obedient. Most of the shelter workers are young women, at least in the shelters that I visited. So it was very annoying for men. And some of you might think, okay, but Honduras, for example, it's a very dangerous place, and migrants, when they were living in Honduras, maybe didn't have complete ownership of the space. And that is true. But when I asked them, they did say that they could go in their neighborhoods to have a beer, to walk around. It wasn't the same. Here in Mexico, they have to be completely nervous and hidden all the time. They lost completely the little ownership or a lot of ownership they had, no? And at the same time, women feel extremely scared of experiencing sexual violence. And it's true, there's a lot of sexual violence on the road. But it's interesting that these women, the ones who come with their partners and their children, are even more scared of experiencing sexual violence than women who travel by themselves that I interviewed. And they tell me that they are very scared about the sexual violence because of how it will feel and what will make, I mean, how they will feel about it, but also because their families will know that they were violated, no? And this will change the dynamics of the family and the way the family sees her. So it's an additional burden for them to be the victims of sexual violence. As a consequence of these two complementary fears, I think, many men tend to become serious to protect who they see as the most vulnerable of the group, which is women and children. And that means they prevent them from talking to other migrants, interacting a lot, being very public or visible. And women kind of accept this role because they want to be protected, but also because they sense that their husbands need this reaffirmation of their power in the family. So these families, as I see it, try to recreate the public domestic sphere in public, the domestic sphere in public. So they sit together in a corner. The woman tends to do more domestic type of jobs. So she washes the clothes, she cooks, she takes care of the children, she talks only to other women, while the men go out, symbolically, and kind of talk to other migrants, ask for money on the streets, take jobs. And women stay like closed in their invisible domestic bubble because they're in a public space constantly. But these invisible houses provide them with the sensation of being slightly more protected than other migrants. But I think it's interesting because these invisible houses that these couples create have contrasting meanings. On the one hand, the houses are a place of sanctuary, of rest, or protection, but on the other, they can be a space of control, of gender roles, of gender norms, of violence. And I think both things are happening. Women are a little bit more limited and men are more controlling, but at the same time, they both feel that's important to keep the family unit complete. And I think that's very interesting. This across in the Sonoran Desert that an artist put where a dead body of a migrant was found. In general, families, straight, queer, only men migrating together as families that live together, regardless of their composition, remain isolated from the rest of the migrants, as we saw in the straight families. And this doesn't protect them. This prevents them from getting up-to-date and reliable information about how to survive during their journeys and during the migration process. And this makes them make mistakes that I think they wouldn't have made if they had associated with other migrants. So for example, there is this story about Reno and Darwin. Reno and Darwin were a couple of brothers who decided to leave Central America because they had been threatened by the migrants, and they left without their wives. So they were just two brothers. When they crossed Mexico, they realized that it was very dangerous, very scary. They got very scared because they saw a man kidnap, a sicario probably, kidnap a group of migrants, and they decided they couldn't trust anybody except themselves. So they were completely separated from the migrant network. Now they tried to stay close to the migrants and eavesdrop on their conversations. And they did try to follow along the route where the smugglers were taking the migrants, no, in the highways. But they didn't participate in the community of the rest of the migrants. They didn't chat with other migrants on the migrant houses. They didn't incorporate anyone into their new social ties. And that led them to not have information when they decided to buy a machete. They bought a machete from a farmer in Palenque. And when they were living with the machete, I told them, I don't think it's a good idea to live with the machete because it's very heavy and I'm worried that someone will attack you if they see that you have a machete. And they were like, no, everything's fine. So they left. And as soon as they left, this older man, migrant, came to me and he told me they're stupid because they shouldn't have left with a machete. If they had talked to the people, if they weren't so sangrones, so conceited, we would have told them that it's not a good idea to do that. There's gangs, pandillas close by. And if the gangs see you with a gun, they will kill you. And I was very angry at the man because the guys had just left. I mean, like we couldn't run behind them, but the guys had just left and he knew they were making a big mistake. And he told me, yeah, but we didn't tell them because they weren't talking to us and they didn't trust us. So what's the point? And a couple of days later, we found out that Reno and Darwin had been found murdered. Of course, I cannot tell for certain that they were killed because they had a machete, but a lot of people agreed that that's what happened. And that shows that they didn't participate in the community and they didn't give this information. Sometimes the families make these types of mistakes because they don't interact with other migrants. And in general, for example, people in the road family, so people who do form small associations, are more willing to talk to migrants outside their group, but also more willing to exchange information among themselves, and that helps them get fresh and reliable information. So I think this shows that social ties are still very important for migrants, but it also shows that not all social ties are as useful when you're migrating in transit. And a lot of studies, I guess if you study the crossing of migrants like from Mexico to the United States, there's a lot of studies that show that having social networks like friends and family who tell you how to cross, where to go, who help you, increase your chances of surviving and of being successful very much. But in transit, when what you have to cross is 3,000 kilometers of uncertainty, it turns out it's better, more strategic to get together with people who are migrating at the same time as you. And well, to conclude, this is a border wall in Tijuana, and this is when the first caravan in 2018 arrived. Those migrants are not really trying to cross without papers right now. There was another protest in the other side of the park of Americans who were welcoming them, and they were like very happily jumping on top of the border wall because they were excited to see people welcoming them. And I like to end it with the border wall in Tijuana. Maybe I should get another picture of another border wall. So yeah, to conclude, my social ties are still important, but it's better to form social ties on the road and to talk to other people. And I think this research shows that even in times of extremely violent circumstances, people still have social lives. They are not merely surviving. because I feel that sometimes when we read and we talk about migrants who are crossing the Mediterranean or Central or Mexico on their way to the US, we imagine that there's only suffering all the time. And there's tons of suffering, I showed you. But there's also a lot of love. They get bored, they get angry, they play soccer, they dance. And this, I think my research shows that migrants have social lives while they're enduring these very dangerous circumstances. And I think that shows, obviously, that they're complete people that can experience a whole range of emotions, and they're not like in pause, merely surviving when they're trying to get to the United States, which is how I feel some people sometimes portray them. Also, migrants are not associating to be strategic. There is an element of wanting to be seen and to be loved that it's important to them. So this is not a book or a presentation just about the survival strategies of migrants, because they're strategic and yeah, they try to be strategic, but also there's this element of wanting to be recognized, of finding love, that it's important to them. And then we see that the solidarity in these road families remains even when things get hard. And for many migrants, the people they met on the road are the best things that happened while migrating. And they remember fondly the people they met on the road. And I mean, this is more tangential to the book, but I hope I showed a little bit with the presentation and also with the book, how the Mexican government, with the help of the United States, is creating the conditions that create the violence for the migrants. So migrants don't take the train or walk on the train tracks or walk on the highway. Just no, don't do that because it's fun or because they want an adventure. They do that because they cannot legally, or they don't have permission to take a bus that takes 2 days to get to the border, or a flight to get to the northern border. They have no permission to do that because Mexico is making it very difficult for them to cross. Mexico is the one that is making the train go faster, that is putting the durmientes next to the train tracks, that is putting the roadblocks and the checkpoints there. And this is important to notice because sometimes we think it's inevitable that migrants suffer so much. I know, what can we do? Let's just give them water and shoes and whatever. But actually, a very simple way of stopping the pain and suffering of these migrants is stop preventing them to get to the United States, well, to the northern border legally, and just allow them to cross legally. And I think this shows the role of Mexico in making it more difficult for migrants to cross. Although, again, I don't think this is the main point of the book, but I think it's always important to stress that when those presentations about migration. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Diaz de Leon. This was a fantastic presentation. And oh, that's very nice. You're getting a lot of claps here. So that's really, really great. So please, if you have any questions, put them on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I think if you're in a Mac, it's at the top. We already have several, so I will start with some of them. And I have some of my own, but I'll leave those out to give preference to our attendees. An anonymous responder asks, when it comes to the social ties you mentioned, did you get findings on role models of migrants that have succeeded and inspired them?
Should I answer now? Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, many migrants wanted to go because of their family members that were there that had succeeded, and they were very inspired by them. But I think it's interesting to talk about this because a lot of the migrants that I interviewed told me that they didn't want to tell their families how horrible the journey was because they didn't want to worry them. And from what I've read, but that's not my expertise, migrants, when they arrive at the US, don't tell their families. Usually they're living in very cramped rooms, in difficult conditions, no? And there's this beautiful book by Eva Moravska. It's a very, very old research. She's a sociologist. How Polish migrants in the 20s rented these clothes and posed in front of buildings or of cars and send the pictures to their families in Poland to show them that they were doing okay. And I don't think that's deceiving for deceiving. I think it's to make the family feel like, reassured that they're doing okay. But I feel a lot of the migrants have these ideas of they tell me a lot, voy a ser una reina en Estados Unidos. I will be a queen in the US when I get there. And I think it's a little bit because their families are not telling them the truth about how things go. So that's as role models. As practical, useful information, as I mentioned, they cannot give them very, very useful information for crossing Mexico because things change very quickly. Thank you.
That's a great answer. Yeah. I have, God, this gives me even more things that I want to ask, but I have another question here from an anonymous responder. And this is perhaps a very simple one to answer. It's a pregunta panameña. Did you find migrants that had crossed el tapón del Darién? And if so, were there any differences that you noticed in their journeys?
Yeah, it's a very good question. This research was done before we had so many migrants crossing the Tapón de Darién, but I'm doing field work right now with female migrants that are in a migrant shelter in Mexico City, and I've interviewed a couple of Colombians and Venezuelans, and they say that crossing the Tapón de Darién was super horrible, but that crossing Mexico is even worse, which honestly surprised me because the Tapón de Darién sounds very, very, very difficult to cross. But they say crossing Mexico is even worse and more frustrating. But in the past, no. And having these new migrants, Venezuelans, Cubans, might affect the way my theories of social networks work because we don't know how they relate to other nationalities. No, we would have to check that. Yeah, thank you.
That makes sense. Yeah, no, I think for a long time, especially you and I and most other Mexicans have known that crossing Mexico is difficult for many reasons, right? And one of them is, you know, the tremendous violence that the migrants are subjected to. But I have another question. Dr. Efren Delgado, thanks for joining us, mentions, is Mexico giving migrants the opportunity to immigrate legally into Mexico?
Kind of. There's a couple of visas that Guatemalans can have, like for farm workers, or like, how do you call, like cyclical visas they can use. So they can do that. And when they get here, migrants can apply for two things: for refugio, for asylum, and that's not as difficult to do as in the United States, but the government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador hasn't given a lot of money to Comar. It hasn't increased the money to Comar, even though there's more people applying for asylum, or migrants can apply for a humanitarian visa if they suffer a lot of violence on the road or they have other characteristics, they're minors and things like that. And that takes a little bit longer also. It takes like 6 months to 1 year to get it. So they can apply, and some apply strategically and some apply because they want to stay, but most of the ones that I've seen still want to go to the United States. But for example, there's not a transit visa that migrants can apply to and then transit Mexico legally, which I think would be ideal. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it would offer more protection. So
yeah, although when I present in border cities, and maybe you guys count as a border city, but on the other side, students always tell me, but they would flood my city, and what would we do with all the migrants invading us? So, yeah.
Okay, here's another question, and I'm guessing this has to do with the social ties and the networks that they're forming. Are there any differences between that you had detected between South Mexican and Central American migrants in those networks that they might be forming and ties that they might be forming in their journey?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when I was doing fieldwork in Nogales, I was working in the Kino Border Initiative Shelter, and they were receiving a lot of deported Mexicans, internally displaced Mexicans who wanted to go to the US, and Central American migrants. And I heard them talk, and they did exchange information. And for example, people from Guerrero and Michoacan considered themselves migrants already, even when they were in Nogales, Mexico, before going. And I got the sense that they did have the same migrante identity, like people, suffering and exploited and poor and things like that. But I didn't get to study a lot of social networks formed by Mexican migrants in the southern border. Although that's a very, very good, I mean, that's a very interesting question. Someone should do research on that. Yeah.
Perhaps a possibility for some future study comparing populations.
Yeah.
An anonymous reader responder asks, what are your thoughts on the need for critical abilities for migrants? Is it possible to facilitate, sorry, give me 1 second. I can't see the full question. Is it possible to facilitate this for them on the road? Just wondering about ways that helps them identify deceiving behavior or misinformation along the way, rather than just intuition, social bonds, amazing findings, and presentation.
Thank you. I don't know, because I have a paper on that, and it's complicated because I feel like, yes, I agree with the person who gave the anonymous comment, and they should tell me their name, that it's a very simple way to discover who is a trustworthy migrant. No, it sounds like anyone, like, oh, like worn shoes, tattered shirt, humble. It sounds like the generic description of a migrant. And it's so generic that the nuns in the migrant houses, the staff in the migrant houses, and the migration agents give me the same description, which I find crazy, because obviously there's not just one type of good person ever, no? Good migrant, good person, good professor, good anything, trustworthy. But it's very, the symbols of a trustworthy migrant, the way migrants and people on the road describe it, are very easy to manipulate and to and to abuse. And that's why there's a lot of there's also a lot of betrayal and mistrust, and enganchadores can pretend to be migrants, and I can be deceived myself. So I think it's a good point, but I don't know how we could teach migrants to detect deceiving people. People in migrant houses try to do it, and they try to warn them, but it's so, the cost of imitating a migrant is so low that it's very easy for everyone to do it. And if that person is interested, there's a very good book by Diego Gambetta and Hamil about how taxi drivers identify safe fares in New York and Belfast. And it's a little bit that, and the conclusion is it's impossible because people can pretend to be a good fare anyway. So yeah.
Thank you even for the recommendation. So there is a little bit of a follow-up on the Tapón de Darién situation, and it's not a question, it's just a comment, by the way. There's about 1,000 migrants that are coming out of the Tapón each day. Many of them are dying in the jungle. Cartels there are just as bad, if not as worse, than Sinaloa. Doctors Without Borders are waiting for them and trying to save lives as they come out. There's a true humanitarian crisis there.
No, thank you. And I agree. In a couple of interviews, women have told us, and this it just seems crazy, that when people cannot carry their children anymore, they just leave them there, knowing and not hoping, knowing that someone will pick them up and give it to that IOM tent when they get to the other side, and they will be reunited. And apparently it happens a lot, but I think it shows how difficult it is, and it surprises me that they think Mexico is worse. But of course, it's their experiences, no? And we have to believe their interpretations. Yeah.
Well, this actually has to do with some of my questions that I've been having, and one of them is, I think, so I wanted you to try to expand a little bit, if you can, on the need for road social ties, right? Because this is a particular group. So when we examine social ties generally, as sociologists, myself like you, when we examine social ties, we examine them generally in place, right? I mean, there's a community that you live there, and your social ties are kind of, whether they're primary or secondary, right? Or strong or weak, they're kind of like in the network that you've already formed, if you will, or in the network that the networks that are established there for you. But this is a different situation, right? These are kind of there's a need to create new social ties that are kind of out of both, like you were saying, convenience and support, right? For different reasons. So these kinds of social ties, do you see them as, and I know several are very similar to the ones that you would establish normally in your, if you stayed in your community. Do you see any difference to these kind of social ties that are made by the need to the social ties that you would kind of form normally in your place or community?
I think the main difference that I see is that the social ties that we form on our community, they're usually a little bit, I mean, we have our strong ties and then we have our weak ties, and all the ties are a little bit connected, no? And there's more social control in the social ties. So if I'm super mean to my colleague, maybe people will stop talking to me, or they will scold me, no? If I hit my son, maybe people will, I mean, maybe I will face consequences from my community and my social ties. And the way I understand the social ties, for example, the small ones that migrants form, they're completely isolated. I mean, they're just this group of people that maybe interacts like one-off with people that are crossing and on the train tracks, but they're not embedded in a community. And I think that means that it's easier to betray because there's no social punishment for betrayal. So there's many stories of people who are, well, not many, but some stories of people who are, for example, they're showering and one is taking care of the backpacks and then the guy runs away with all the backpacks. No? And you cannot do anything because they're not embedded in a community, but also because I think the route flows to the north. So if the guys just move ahead, there's no reputation to be formed. You can, I mean, the same estafador is in the same town for months on end because new migrants come all the time and he can just lie and lie to them. So I think that's one of the main differences between like regular social ties and these social ties. However, even though that makes it more easier to betray if you are a betrayer, if you're like someone who really needs the help to get to the northern border, it's not so smart to let your social network, I mean, to betray your social network and get kicked out to your social group, because people don't tend to want to form ties with people in Mexico City or on the northern border because they're like, why is he alone? He probably did something to their family. So it's usually easier to just stay with your group if you want to remain in a group. So, yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It was fascinating to read. So, one of the things that you just mentioned is actually really, really fascinating. I hope maybe, I mean, it'll be difficult, but I hope at some point it can be studied and maybe you can study it, which is, so I agree with what you're saying, which is there's less, so because there's not a community overseeing this, there's less social repercussions. But you just mentioned, however, there are social repercussions at the end, right? In other words, at the end of the journey, once you get there, if you're getting there alone because you betrayed a bunch of people, then all of a sudden it's like, why is this person there? So the trust issue does exist, and there might be a repercussion at the end, which is, well, I don't want to help them, I don't want to bond with them, I don't want to be with them, because if they weren't able to create a social group in their journey, that doesn't speak very well of them. So that is fascinating. That is just absolutely fascinating. I have one more question, and it had to do with if you had any inkling of why, and I have some ideas, but I really want to hear from you if you find anything on this, any data on this. Why is it that the road families are mainly males? Does it have to do with like gendered violence issues? In other words, once two males are together, maybe women, women that are some of the women that are traveling alone maybe are like, well, I don't want to actually be tagged to that group. Or does it have to do with male bonding patterns? And did you get any idea of why were these mainly male groups? And the follow-up to that question was, were there actually road families that were mainly women, so two women together, or two or something like that?
And I don't know. That's a good question, but I don't know. When I was doing fieldwork, most of the men I saw were men, so that's a simple answer. Um, I was told that women usually migrate with smugglers, and we just don't see them. So the men that I see in the migrant houses are the poorest, or the ones that have the worst smugglers. So usually people try to save more money for women. Um, but also, yes, I interviewed a couple of women who had joined the road family and were migrating with men, and some of them sometimes just felt unsafe. Someone tried to grope them, and also when I asked men about this, I was in a previous version of this research, I was criticized for this, and I think it was a fair criticism, but I will say it anyway. So a lot of migrants, when I asked them, would you migrate with a woman? They were like, no, they're slower. We have to take care of them. If they get raped, we will get beaten. So they didn't want to migrate with women. And I was criticized because I was told, I mean, why do you ask that of migrants? What do we care about that? But maybe it's because of that. So I think it's all those things. But women do try to migrate together when they get together, but I didn't see a lot of them. I think things might have changed right now, but I'm doing fieldwork right now near Mexico City, and there's also mostly men and women's migrating with their partners. Yeah. What were you guessing, or why did you think?
Well, no, my idea was partially those things. I think probably a couple of things, right? One of them, this is just my idea, and I'm not an expert, and I am totally, so this would just be possible hypothesis that I had based on just reading the literature. One of them was exactly that, fear of, multiple males together and sexual violence and safety. But the other one was actually what you mentioned, which was these ideas of groups of men that all of a sudden, you know, the bond is different, right? Which is if this guy falls out of the train or whatever, too bad. If it's a woman, I feel, and it has to do with the machismo part that I mentioned. Just I feel like I am perhaps responsible. I should have taken better care of them. Or the same thing with children, probably, right? I should have taken better care of them. So in other words, it's something else to worry about in an
Yep.
already difficult journey. So and it seems that you did get some responses like that.
Yeah.
There's a comment here that I want to post to you because it's really nice. Maria Luisa Picardiami says, it seems that social rules do generate and there are consequences if not followed. They are orally transmitted, knowledge, best practices, lessons learned. Your work is so rich.
Thank you, Maria Luisa. Thank you very much. And yes, I think that's what I didn't say it in the presentation, but that's what I think happens with the transient community of migrants. They share information and and orally. So yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for liking it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Diaz de Leon. Again, fascinating work and work that we need more of, right? We generally have these very particular types of studies about migrants, and we kind of reproduce them. So this is new, this is different, this is interesting, and I hope you have a full career exploring some of the rich nuances of this. So we need this work. So we really appreciate you being here. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us, and we hope to see more and more and more of this on this type of research from you. One last thing I want to say besides thank you very much is please buy the book. It's amazing. We put it in the chat. We put the link to the University of Arizona Press, and you get 30% off if you get that code that we put in there. So do yourself a favor, buy the book. It's amazing. Thank you again, Dr. Diaz de Leon. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here to close the 50 participants that were here. I want to also just remind you that our next speaker on our series is going to happen on the 29th, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the 29th of November, so a month from now, and it's going to be Dr. Francisco Lara Valencia. We are changing our time. Instead of doing 12 to 1:15 like we always do, we're changing our time a little bit to accommodate Dr. Lara Valencia, so it's going to be at 11:30. We hope to see you there. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Alejandra Diaz de Leon, for an awesome presentation. Adiós todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí y por compartir con nosotros este espacio.
Gracias. Bye.
Bye.